So very recently, the topic of the match-fixing bans that were suffered by former members of iBuyPower and Epsilon has been brought back to the forefront, mostly via community discussion on the CSGO subreddit, where some different users had posted some threads about the idea of revisiting the bans, and then most importantly, and probably the biggest piece of literature that came out that really brought it back up was in fact an open letter from Richard Lewis, who of course was the journalist who had originally discovered all of this in the first place through his investigation, and he got put through hell throughout that entire process via members of the community or the players themselves or what have you. He certainly went through some rough times to get that story out there, and it was only even in his own words, he says like Valve was kind of the saving grace to finally help him out with their own investigation to legitimize what he had done, and to basically kind of turn his community image around in that particular case. And so he, having a huge personal connection to everything, he put out an open letter discussing the need for it to be revisited as well, which I think that alone speaks volumes, that the man who had so much invested into this and had so much grief come from it is one of the leaders of a voice or a group of people who are voicing this idea that this should be looked at again. Now, I'm not going to get too much to the details of it because I feel like everyone already knows what happened. I mean, basically, at the end of January of this year, it was found that these people threw a match. A number of people are involved, but I think the ones that are most relevant to modern day CS:GO going forward would be people like Daze, Swag, AZK, and Steel. Though like I said, there were some other people involved into that. And they denied it pretty much the whole way through. I mean, Richard Lewis is releasing these articles. He has this screenshot of conversations. Initially, Shazam talking to someone on Steam, and then Deborn text messages with his girlfriend. All this evidence comes out, really pointing to the fact that these people had done something. You know, all the players are denying it. Basically saying they had nothing to do with it. It's all a bunch of bullshit. But Valve eventually steps in, investigates it with the help of Richard Lewis, and I believe Honey from CSGO Lounge finds that, yeah, it did in fact happen. And then the players kind of go quiet for a while. Slowly but surely they release some statements apologizing, or maybe some of the more brazen folks in the group like Daze and Steel tried to point to the fact that it's kind of Valve's fault for not having rules in place, and it's also the fault of the community at large for accepting these betting sites who can be running very shady operations in the first place, and so they're just taking advantage of the system that was put in place that was flawed. So maybe even kind of sidestepping some of their personal responsibility. I think this was mostly Steel who did that. But regardless, they did eventually own up to it, but they did lie throughout the entire investigation as far as saying that they hadn't done it, hoping, I guess, that they would never get caught. Now, the Epsilon situation happened very shortly afterwards, just the next month in February, except these players were actually basically confessing, and, like FXO, for example, made a big Facebook post and a vlog talking about how it did in fact happen, and so that I guess they were much more open to admitting their guilt, so to speak, right? And that's basically the two major cases of match-fixing bans. We had another one happen with some Polish players, but it got recanted, and so it never actually was a big deal. So these are, I guess, the two major cases that have been confirmed, and they all happened very early on in the year, right? Now, the biggest difference was, I guess in both cases, the results of the investigation and the punishments that were dealt were quite ambiguous. But we did at least get word from the Epsilon ban via FXO that apparently it was a year sentence, in the sense that either they were banned for a year or Valve was going to revisit it in a year and decide whether they were going to extend the ban or not. Obviously, all the leagues like Faceit and ESEA and CEVO, all these people were banned from those leagues for a year for sure, and then it'll be revisited at that time whether they're extended or not. However, one of the other big reasons why this is even being discussed again is also because CEVO did unban these players from the PUG service on CEVO. They still can't compete in the league, but they can now use the pugging service. And so that was kind of another thing that brought this all back in. So now we're starting to see this idea of maybe it's going to be revisited in a year. We're already seeing some leagues kind of lift some of the punishments a little bit. And then, like I said, all the community response is bringing this all back in. So basically, I just wanted to give my take on it. I don't necessarily have a whole lot of new stuff to add to it, but I did want to kind of just give my piece as a guy who works in the NA CSGO scene and has been doing so since the beta of CSGO. and knowing all these guys from working with them at different events or with, I've interviewed Steele on an episode of The Hype. I've, seen these guys like grow in the scene, and so I feel like I have a little bit of something to add to it just from my perspective, being involved in the NA community. And here's the biggest thing, is the ambiguity of it all. The lack of clarity is probably the biggest problem that I have with the whole situation. And it's been that way ever since the beginning. Now, don't get me wrong. I felt that they deserved to be punished, and I definitely know what they did was wrong. There's no question to either of those things. But bottom line is there were no clear rules in place. There's no clear punishment in place. So really, it's very murky. Like, obviously, we know what they did was wrong. Obviously, we know they deserve some type of penalty for it. But how do you define that penalty? How do you define their guilt exactly? It's very, very much a gray area that I don't think has ever really had any light shed on it by the most important group that needs to, which is in fact Valve themselves, who were the ones who issued the punishment anyway. And the punishment that was issued that we at least heard from Valve's face was this whole idea that these people should not be involved in any capacity with Valve-sponsored events. I think that was like the exact wording almost. That was at least in the case of the iBuyPower press release or blog that they did, I believe, at the end of January. With Epsilon, pretty much all the information we got came via Epsilon players coming out and saying, hey, this is what we heard from Valve. Now, we had some reminders from Valve because I know Steele and Days were involved in some coaching, and so I got picked up as an analyst by Cloud9. There was a reminder like, hey, we don't want these guys involved in any capacity. That means coaching. That means these other things when it comes to any type of Valve-sponsored events, in which case you did see some of these groups backpedal with Steele not being involved with CLG anymore as a coach, and Swag being moved to just a streamer for Cloud9 instead of an analyst. So we have had, I guess, like some other words come in from Valve, but they still never really cleared up the initial statements that they made. It's still not very clear to us what the deal is. And so, Richard Lewis makes this open letter. I'm not going to talk about everything he said in there. You should definitely go read it, though. But he addresses this. He says that an indefinite punishment with no clear end date or appeal basically leads to this huge lack of clarity, and it leads to these people not being able to plan properly for their future. These people are still very much involved in CSGO, whether they do it via streaming or whether they do it via tutorial videos on YouTube, or just whatever the case may be. You can definitely still see that these people are active in CSGO. They're even playing at some smaller CSGO events in North America that will allow them to play, that aren't a part of the major leagues or aren't, a part of a Valve-sponsored event, whatever that means. So you can almost see that these people do have some hope that at some point in time they will be able to enter back into the competitive scene of Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And the problem is if Valve is for sure that they don't want that to happen, then they need to make it very clear to these people that it is in fact the case. Because right now there's this idea that maybe it'll be revisited, maybe Valve will change their minds. The punishment that they named was quite vague after all, so we don't really know for sure if they meant lifetime or what. So yeah, I think that's a huge problem. At the very least, whether or not you agree or disagree with their ban, or whether or not you agree or disagree with whether the fact they should be unbanned or not, no matter what, I think at the base level, at the very least, we should get some clarity here from Valve on what in fact they meant. What in fact is the punishment for these players. Is there any way that they will be able to come back, or is it in fact for a lifetime, or is it in fact only going to last a year? We also need them to put a better, clearly defined rule in place for handling situations like this involving their game. I feel like there needs to be some set punishment put in place, in tandem with a set rule, just to make sure that if this does happen again in the future, that we actually have something to go to and rely upon on how to deal with the situation. So I definitely think that at the very least we just need some more clarity. We need some really defined guidelines to go by. At the very least, if nothing else happens or changes, we need at least that to move forward, I feel like. And it still hasn't happened, and it's been 8 months since the initial bans or so. I'm still, we're pretty much in the dark as much as we were before. Now, Another point that Richard Lewis makes in his open letter is that, he understands the need for severe punishments and match fixing. He even advocates them. Obviously, he felt these people should be punished and people should be brought to justice. He was part of leading the investigation, so he realizes all those things. But apparently, and he even, supports this idea of competitive integrity. Like, we need to be able to deal with these problems properly to make sure that sponsors and major corporations and things like that, or organizations that want to be involved in these sports, don't, become, I don't know what the word is. Like, they no longer are attracted to the scene. They no longer want to be a part of it. We don't want to scare people off or make people want to turn away because they feel that what we have is not legitimate. We've been fighting for legitimacy forever in esports, and so for something like this to happen and take away from that is certainly a big step backwards, and that's certainly why we need to understand how to, put in some proper consequences for these actions. He then goes on to talk about like the environment that the team may have been in that may have given them the mindset to want to do such a thing because of maybe lack of proper compensation or being in a wealth disparity or whatever. I don't want to go too much into that, but one of the key things that he says is that, and what I believe as well, is that the only rules that were in place about the situation were clear moral implications, and these were discounted multiple times by multiple players. The former Alba Power players were examples for anyone else even thinking about committing similar crimes. But let's be under no illusion. As sure as tough sentences don't stop capital crimes, a disproportionate punishment for these players won't stop others trying their hand in future, especially now that private cash betting sites are online. So there's really two key things that come from this statement from Richard Lewis that needs to be paid attention to. The first one being that punishment doesn't necessarily match the crime in this situation. A severe punishment, making an example of someone, is the famous quote, doesn't necessarily have much of an effect, to be quite honest. Like, there's no way you can say that this will not happen again just because we made an example of these people. It's entirely not true. In fact, let's be honest here. The only people who are probably deterred from doing this are teams that have a chance at making it to a Valve major, have a chance at making the sticker money, have a chance at the big prize pools. So that basically is limited to the top teams of a particular country, so like the cream of the crop of particular nations, or just maybe in general the top 36 or so teams in the world or something like that, right? Because if the only real punishment is being banned from Valve-sponsored events, or at least that's the only official punishment that Valve will deal, the individual leagues may also tack on to that. We already saw that happen in this case, for example. But if you're like an amateur team or your team playing in a show match, a match doesn't really mean anything. It's not helping you qualify for a LAN or qualify for a big prize pool. So basically it's just an exhibition at that point. It doesn't really matter. Or like I said, if you're a lower level team that either isn't going to be talented enough to make it to a Valve sponsored event like a major, or has maybe even no ambition to, you're just playing for fun, but you happen to be pretty good, so you're on like a semi-pro team or something like that. And then some of these matches that get put on Go Lounge are like teams that make no sense. They're not professional teams. It's not a high level of competition in comparison to elite level Counter-Strike. And so these matches are almost meaningless, and in which case, if you can profit more money by throwing a game than whatever you might earn for winning that match for that league or whatever, then yeah, people are still going to be tempted to do it despite the fact that they've seen what's happened to these people, because like I said, their punishment's just from Valve-sponsored events. Who do these amateur teams care about that? So that should be a clear example enough to kind of understand that a severe punishment isn't necessarily going to deter anyone really. So basically, that's like the point one, is like, this is not necessarily going to be a deterrent, so don't treat it that way. The second point is just making it clear that there were no rules in place. I kind of already mentioned that. It's only just this idea of what's morally right and wrong rather than actually a set rule in place. That's a big deal. And then finally, it's just about finding a punishment that fits the crime. And, he made one point that, like, fixing one inconsequential game in a small league really warrants a lifetime ban in any other sport. And I think that just kind of sums it up nicely, is that, does this action really require a lifetime ban? It certainly probably does require a punishment, but is a lifetime ban really the necessary one, right? I think a year ban probably does enough damage to these people. I mean, they've already lost out on salary for a year, because I'm sure they could have been on the top team with the salary. They lost out on all the sticker money opportunities. They lost out on opportunities to qualify for majors. They missed out on, you know, 2 or 3 lands, maybe more for ESEA. Same with CEVO. Same with Face It. You know, all these other events in tournaments that they missed out opportunities on prize pool wise. Their career has been put on standstill for a year, trying to be active in esports, and at the very least, it could even be longer than that, because if they still have hope that they can eventually be reintroduced into the community, then it's going to take them even longer to kind of adjust if in fact they are told no. So it could even last longer than a year as far as the impact it has on them moving forward in their future and what they do with their lives. So you can put all that in there. It also permanently affects their reputation going forward, regardless of whether you lift the ban or not. I mean, come on, let's be honest here. Certain organizations and sponsors and such are going to be way less likely to want to have anything to do with these people going forward based on what's already happened. So that's still money and opportunities that they're going to be missing out on as you move forward. Now, I'm not saying that that this is bad, like they don't deserve to have these problems. Sure, they deserve to have been punished, but I think enough damage has already been done. I think the lesson has been learned in the sense that probably shouldn't do this again. And I like I said, I just think that they, if they do in fact get unbanned after a year, then I would have no problem with that, because I think that they have already paid their dues, so to speak, done their time, however you want to put it. So basically, to sum this all up, then, is that there were no clear rules in place, no clear punishments in place. These are 2 big problems that need to be addressed going forward, no matter what happens to these particular players I've mentioned. We need to have better, guidelines in place. We need to have a better understanding of what, in fact, will happen if those guidelines are breached. Also, another key point in all this is that it seems, from the information we got from the whole Epsilon situation, that they were only dealt a year ban, or at least their, file will be reopened in a year and reviewed, and then we'll make another decision from there. Whereas we got this whole idea of an indefinite suspension with iBuyPower. Now, I don't get why their punishments would really be that much different. I mean, granted, I understand that Epsilon kind of came clean right away rather than lying about it for weeks on end like iBuyPower people did. So maybe just off that fact alone, you can understand as to why Epsilon's punishment may be less than iBuyPower's, and maybe that's even true. But come on, the gap between a year and possibly a lifetime ban, that's a little bit too big of a gap to me between severity and punishment between these 2 groups of people over just the simple fact that Epsilon decided to, confess once they got busted. As opposed to iBuyPower, who lied about it for a few weeks. So I think that's certainly a problem, if that is in fact the case. In general, it's just a big lack of clarity, and it's been, a situation with a huge lack of clarity for too long of amount of time. We should already know what's going on. We should already have a really clear answer on what's going to happen. And then from there, we can actually make a judgment call on whether or not we feel that those actions are appropriate. But we at least need to see some action. We at least need to know what we're dealing with. And right now, we still don't really have a clear indication of what that, in fact, is going to be. And then, like I said, I think the year punishment seems severe enough to me. And I hope that these people can come back into the community because I realize they did something horribly wrong, and I won't doubt that. But I think they've been punished adequately, so to speak, after a year of banning. I also have my own selfish reasons for why I'd like to see these people unbanned, being a fan of the NA Counter-Strike scene and wanting to see it grow and thrive. First off, you have people like Steel and Days who would be great in-game leaders in a region that I think really lacks from having great IGLs. Whether that means that like Steel and Days go on 2 separate teams and then lead 2 separate teams, and then hopefully that makes 2 separate teams that match up well with Cloud9 and CLG, and you have like more top teams in the region overall, or whether it be like Days and Steel to stay together on one team and form up another really good team that can kind of rival Cloud9 and CLG. Whatever the case may be, it would bring more talent to the North American scene and maybe give us at least one more top team in the region that has the potential to compete internationally and can cause some good matchups within the region. I think these people do add to the community with their content, at the very least, between their streaming content, their tutorial content, their demo review, all that stuff. I think that does add to the community. It helps new players learn. It helps People get great insight from good minds in the scene, and so definitely I think that would help. And even I just mentioned those two players as examples, but still Swag's a great player that could still be added to the scene and be able to have an impact somewhere. Same with AZK. These are guys that are talented players that could add to the overall talent pool of North America and hopefully add to a particular team and some type of combination that would form, like I said, at least one more good team in the region. Like there's been talks of Swag joining Cloud9. He's already under contract as a streamer by them. He joins the starting lineup. Maybe for Sean Gares, that role-wise, that would make sense as far as what they do in-game fragging-wise, right? You have Swag become the lurker for the team next to Nothing, who's into the other extremity player, while you have like the entering duo Freakazoid and Shroud, with Scoodle being the opper, so to speak. And then you just have Sean Gares calling as an in-game leader, but from a coaching position. So that means you get like a more skilled like lurker or fragger and Swag in the server, helping the team execute things, while you have a great mind behind them being a coaching in-game leader. So that could be a great impact that Swag could have for Cloud9 right there if in fact the ban is lifted, on top of this other discussion I've had with Dazed and Steel being able to be good IGLs or be on the same team. Maybe just have a team of the banned players, AZK, Steel, and Dazed all on the same team, that trio with a couple of people, and you form up a good team around them. Maybe people like Liquid, if they're still struggling down the line with the 5 they just picked up with Hiko, they still can't find things that work, and some of that talent splits up, or they want to add more talent to their team and swap more people out. That could help Liquid be a better team. Like I said, either way, you might find yourselves with at least one other team besides CLG and Cloud9 who could like actually compete for a slot at a major, or could compete for top of the region, and can start being a third team that contends somewhat internationally in CSGO. And those are very selfish reasons. I understand that. And it has nothing to do with whether or not that is correct given their crime and things of that nature. But it's just something else I'd like to add from my perspective. It'd be cool to see some of these talented guys get back involved in CS again after all that's happened. I think that my whole point with that is I think that, again, that they have served their time, and I think that they should be allowed another chance to compete. I don't think the crime they committed warrants them being banned forever and being shunned from esports for the rest of their lives. I think that their crime was bad. I disagree with it completely. It has, in my mind, kind of tarnished their character in my eyes permanently, to a degree. But at the same time, I think that they deserve another chance in the scene. And I think they could still add a lot to it, even though their crimes were quite severe and deserve to be punished. But we need some clarity on that punishment. And I think that punishment needs to be fair as well. And so I'll just leave it at that. I didn't want to make this too crazy long. I didn't really have much new to add to the conversation. I think Richard Lewis has already done a great job in his open letter to Valve and kind of how he argued why we should revisit this and why we might need to lift their bans or make them shorter or what have you. I think he's already been a great voice, and I'll link his open letter, in the description below if you haven't seen it already. It's worth your while to read. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of give my 2 cents since I am involved in the NA scene, and I know that this particular story and the events that took place did affect the scene that I enjoyed and covered a lot and talked about a lot. It had a huge toll on the North American talent pool for a very long time. It wasn't until recent times with Cloud9 that North America kind of really recovered on an international scale. And I mean, CLG's been growing too, and that's helped as well. But there was definitely a dark period, so to speak, where the North American scene was stripped of a lot of its value, which, like I said, it was deservedly so. But it would be cool to see that we've already seen the scene start rebuilding. It'd be cool to see it rebuild even more by having some of these talents come back into the scene. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. Thanks a lot.